Hello everybody, how you doing today? I hope you're having a good day. It's a day the Lord has made and you can do something for him. I mean, let's face it, yesterday was the Lord's day and you probably made him some promises that you'll be a better Christian this week than you were last week. And in order for that to happen, you've got to get busy and do those things that God wants you to do. All right, the title of our lesson today is, Are You Comfortable? Now, while we should be comfortable in our Christianity and more importantly in our service to God, we must be careful to not be too comfortable. All right, we have a passage in 1 Peter 1, verses 14 through 16. Peter says, As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior. Because it is written, You shall be holy, for I am holy. See, God commands us to be holy. And this command was given, we read a lot of this in Leviticus. This command was given to the children of Israel many times, and usually each time was a command had just been issued, a statute, a rule had just been issued, and then he'd said, You shall be holy. So the implication is, in order for you to be holy, you have to do what you've been commanded. And so the purpose was to remind them, and when you think about it, it reminds us that only through obedience can we achieve holiness. And often, though, we pick and choose, and many people do this. Many people pick and choose which sins they will refrain from doing and which commands they will choose to obey. And oftentimes we determine for ourselves what is right or wrong instead of letting God tell us what is right or wrong. See, as long as and Proverbs 16:2 says, every man's way is right in his own eyes. So if we're trying to examine and evaluate ourselves, we look and, hey, I'm pretty good. And we compare ourselves to others and we compare ourselves to the wrong standard. We compare ourselves to those people in the world who are just downright evil. Well, I'm better than that, and we feel good about ourselves, and then we get comfortable. But see, that's the wrong standard. The standard we should be striving to achieve is Jesus Christ, being like Jesus, following his example. And that's one of the problems facing the church today is not enough people are trying to be like Christ. They just want to be better than the next person, and that satisfies them. They get comfortable. And so, see, what happens when we decide ourselves what is right or wrong, we're basically kicking Jesus out of his rightful authoritative role. We're saying, well, your authority has no sway over me, or I don't recognize your authority. That's what happens. And you might deny such, but isn't that the case? It really is. See, it is like thinking that the words of Jesus are nothing more than suggestions, which are optional for us. And you know what? Many people treat the commands of God as optional or as suggestions, and they don't treat them as commands. So if the church is going to be what God intends for it to be, we must do our part to recognize the commands of Jesus and God and do them to the best of our ability. And so we have to strive each day to be more holy. And we have to stop pointing our finger at others and start examining ourselves. We need to stop comparing ourselves to sinners and start comparing ourselves to a holy God, to holy Christ. And it is so easy and comfortable to compare yourself to the horrible sinners out there and feel good about yourself. But the question is, do you measure up to the fullness and stature of Christ? I mean, that's what the early church, that's why the Holy Spirit worked with the Holy Church to give them the guidance to measure up to the fullness and stature of Christ. And we need to be doing the same thing. So let's look at these so-called, and we're going to look at some things. We might call them minor or little sins, and we'll concentrate how we will deal with them in our lives. See, so one of the problems we face is the lack of proper preaching. And, okay, I know I'm a preacher, and so I know I have a responsibility. But I have found over the years that if I preach the truth, I'm not going to be very popular. People don't like people who speak the truth. They want someone who tells them what they want to hear. That's what Paul said would come in 2 Timothy 4, verse 3 and 4. The time will come, they will not endure sound doctrine. And so the preacher learns what the congregation wants to put up with. And so he'll speak against like homosexuality and abortion and murder. That will be, and the congregation will go along with it. And most of the congregation would never let these issues provoke them into sin. I mean, they're just too moral for that. But there are other sins in which the members would rather the preacher not preach on. And I have heard of people being told not to preach on certain subjects and asked not to preach on certain subjects. A few did, and guess what? They were terminated. And so that happens. But when it's a subject from the Bible, there should be nothing off limits. So the type of sermons I'm talking about are the ones that sometimes step on toes. And you know what? That's what people need to hear. They need to hear that, okay, you've become too comfortable. I'm going to rouse things up and make sure you get committed to the Lord the way you should. And so most people do not like it. And while we may call these little sins, although any sin can keep one out of heaven. Do you realize that? A lot of people come up with this idea that, well, God's automatically going to forgive us because we've been baptized and we're going to be saved anyway, despite how many sins we have. We talked about that a few days ago. But there's these sins which we downplay as very little, but the Bible says, man, these are major infractions. And so, like I said, we decide if it's right or wrong and not let God do it. So let's look at some of these little sins, which people call little. Pride. Pride is a little sin to many because they have it. They don't see their own faults. They can certainly see the fault of others, but they don't see their own faults. And that's something we have to do, folks. I mean, we might know, okay, I'm very humble and I try to be humble before God. And when was the last time you truly contemplated your own pride? See, pride will prevent you from acknowledging that you have any sins at all. It'll prevent you from seeing any faults in yourself, and you don't think that, okay, I don't have much to be worried about because I'm so good. God's going to accept me. See, in Proverbs 29:23, it says, a man's pride will bring him low. And in Galatians 6:3, it says, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. And James 4:6, God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before a fall, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. All right, another little sin is greed. I mean, greed is one of those major ones. Greed, pride, and selfishness are the three major ones as far as I'm concerned, but they're all bad, and all the other sins fall within one of these three categories. But anyway, greed is another one that we deal with, and it is very dangerous because it costs so much. I mean, yeah, we have to extend so much in order to get it, and usually it will cost us our soul. See, greed is one of the most selfish things there is. 1 Timothy 6:9 and 10 says, but those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith. In Proverbs 28:25, a greedy man stirs up strife. And 1 Corinthians 6:9 through 11 talks about greed is seen in several of these categories, which will keep one out of heaven. They will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, and greed is listed in that. And it's listed in several of those lists that God says will keep you out of heaven. All right, another sin, which a lot of times we don't even consider this a sin, but it really is. Gossip. when you think of the word gossip, you think about the little busybodies out there just telling stories about others. But you know what? If you start talking about anybody in the church, I mean, in a way, that is gossip. So we all probably have a problem with gossip. And gossip not only hurts you, but has the potential to hurt others. You know, Ephesians 4:29 says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear." I mean, when you start talking about sister so-and-so's faults to others, and guess what? They're probably not going to like her anymore and going to stay away from her. And it could be a lie that you're telling because, oh, you heard it from someone else. Like that song says, heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. I mean, that's sometimes how gossip gets going. See, Proverbs 16:28, a perverse man spreads strife, and a slanderer separates intimate friends. So yeah, that is a problem, you know, associated with gossip. And it doesn't matter if what you're saying is true. If you have a problem with somebody, what did Jesus say? You go to that person. You don't spread it around to everybody else. You go to that person. All right. The next little sin we're going to talk about is something that apparently we all do. And yes, we need to beg. That's why we have to pray for forgiveness all the time, is because we do things like sometimes we don't even realize it. What about lying? Do you realize we do this all the time without even thinking about it? I mean, you're trying to shift the blame either off of yourself or you're trying to make up a story that will make someone, you give them what you think they want to hear. And you don't tell them the truth because the truth might get you in trouble. And sometimes if you do tell the truth, there's always a but behind it. Yeah, well, I didn't do the job you told me to do, but there's a reason for it. That once again is lying. See, when you lie, you take on the characteristics of Satan, because Jesus said Satan is the father of lies. You know, in the list in Proverbs 6:16 through 19, where 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 is abomination, one of those things is a lying tongue. And then, of course, in the 10 Commandments, bearing false witness is something God said don't do. In fact, those who bore false witness were to be stoned to death if they got caught. And Proverbs 12:22 says, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. And Colossians 3:9 through 10 talks about how we relate with each other. Said, do not lie to one another. I mean, you speak good words of kindness and you edify one another, but don't lie to one another. We shouldn't be telling lies, and we should not get in the habit of telling lies. You know, I'm sure we all know people that basically, how do you know they're lying? Is because their lips are moving. I mean, that's just basically what we've come. They tell great stories. I mean, it's fun to listen to them sometimes. They tell some whoppers, but you know what? Down deep, you know, that's nothing but a lie. So don't lie to one another. Another thing that some people don't think about is gluttony. You know, we usually associate gluttony with gorging ourselves on lots of food. But it's not limited to that. I mean, this sin covers anything that is taken to excess, even though in and of itself, it is all right. I mean, there's a lot of things that, yeah, God allows us to do, but if we get so overwhelmed with it that we take it to excess, all of a sudden it takes our focus away from God, and it really, in a sense, becomes an idol. See, Philippians 3:18 and 19 says, for many walk, of whom I often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, and whose glory is in their shame, who set the minds on earthly things. In Proverbs 23:20 and 21, do not be with heavy drinkers of wine, or with gluttonous eaters of meat, for they will come to poverty. So gluttony is a problem that we need to look at. And yeah, I mean, if you go out to a family dinner or a potluck, you gorge yourself on 1 or 2 plates. I mean, that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about just that so much that you basically become incapacitated because you ate so much. All right, another thing which I think everybody would agree, well, this is definitely a sin, but to what degree is it a sin? I mean, lust is a sin. And maybe you have a problem with lust. I mean, you look at the pretty ladies or you look at the handsome guys or whatever, and you imagine things. I mean, and you know these impure thoughts about sex. I mean, we can see it from 1 Peter that the lust covers more than just sexual issues. I mean, he talks about that. Matthew 5:28, whoever lusts has already committed adultery in the heart. It's where we keep our mind. Do we keep our mind on spiritual thoughts, or are we just behaving like the world and doing those things? The desires of the flesh, Galatians 5:16, and it's one of the works of the flesh. And 1 Thessalonians 4:3-5 says, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that is, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion like the Gentiles who do not know God." I mean, we could say this, when we say Gentiles, that just covers everybody. And so the Gentile, people of this world is what we're talking about. People of this world who don't know God, I mean, they're no different than the animals out there. If a female's in heat, the males are all going to be around waiting for their turn. And so that's the way people are who have lust. Another sin we want to talk about is anger. And you know what? Maybe you don't do all those bad things, put that in air quotes. Maybe you don't do all those bad things, but you get angry a lot, or you stir up strife. Either one is bad enough. See, Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." And then, once again, remember the list, 6 things, 7, one who sows discord among the brethren. I mean, God doesn't like that. And Ephesians 4:25-27 says, "Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity." Yeah, anger causes also and leads to a whole lot of other sins. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of the sins we read about happens because someone was angry. Their anger got a hold of them and they just let loose. They probably started cursing. They probably started hurting somebody or even killing them. When Cain decided to kill Abel, he was angry already. And so, here's another sin that you've heard this word before, but you never realize, well, that doesn't apply to me. That applies to somebody else. Hypocrisy. Maybe you struggle with it. I mean, it's nothing more than being deceitful. I mean, you're trying to convince people, well, I'm a good person, and all the while knowing that you're not. I mean, this is another term for lying. Once again, goes along with one of the characteristics of Satan. Matthew 6:1, Jesus said, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven." Matthew 23:1-36, this is the famous passage where he has these woes to the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And he listed what they did. And he warned the people, don't be like them. And so all these woes, there's 7 woes on these scribes and Pharisees. And James 1:26 says, "If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless." Now we can say the same thing about a hypocrisy. We convince ourselves that, hey, we're okay with God and he's okay with us, and all the while we're overlooking the sins that we're doing. Guess what? Our faith, our religion is not going to help us when we stand before God. Now, when you consider all these sins, another problem we have is the idea of who cares? Who cares about this? I mean, we're talking about apathy or indifference. most of the time, nobody cares enough to even consider this. And this is where most of the people in the modern church are these days. You know, in Revelation 3, 15, 16, talking about Laodicea, I wish you were cold or hot, but you are lukewarm. I'll spit you out of my mouth. Matthew 25, 41 through 46, you know, the great judgment scene. And Jesus pointed out, okay, you did this to me. Well, when did we do it to you? Well, the fact that you didn't do it to my children or did it for my children. And so those who didn't do what they should have, I mean, had Christ been there, they may have done it. But when they look at the other Christians, they don't do it. They're going to be cast into the fire. You know, James 2:15, talking about being faithful. I mean, what good is it to say to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and do not give them what is necessary for their body? What use is that? I mean, in John chapter 4, he says a very similar statement. So, I mean, and that's something we have to keep in mind. You know, marriage relationships, sometimes we have a problem where you don't treat your spouse the way you should. And yes, some people let it out and let it know they're in a bad marriage. Others just kind of bottle it up and just deal with it. But some are not married anymore, but they have the instruction to teach others about this great responsibility. And really, I'm talking about like from Titus chapter 2. The older men teach the younger men. The older women teach the younger women how to be good parents, how to be good spouses to their husbands. And so, yeah, I mean, we can still give advice. Now, what's really sad is some of the people on TV that give advice about marriage have already been through 3 or 4 marriages. And they're really not the type of people you need to be listening to. See, in Ephesians 5, 22 through 33, talks about the marriage relationship as a comparison to our Christian relationship with Christ. I mean, that's what it is. And 1 Corinthians 7, most of the chapters dealing with the marriage relationship and maintaining that marriage relationship. In 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8, you know, this in the great chapter of love, as we call it. Love does all these things. And a lot of times we don't give enough emphasis on that. And we really should. Here's another sin that you probably don't think is a sin because you're not doing it and you've never really considered this. But what about not sharing the gospel? What about your lack of evangelism? What evangelistic efforts do you do to try and teach others the gospel, to try and invite others to church, to try and invite others to Bible studies? I mean, do you ever ask forgiveness for not trying to teach others? This is something we really need to consider. Why do we have such a hard time with this command? And really, when salvation is supposedly what motivated us to become Christians in the first place, why do we deprive others of that? I mean, it doesn't really make sense. You know, Jesus said, go preach the gospel to every creature under heaven. He said, go teach all nations in Matthew 28. In Acts 8:4, they went everywhere preaching the word. Why aren't we? That's just a simple question. You know, this list can go on and on if we wanted to, and we could probably step on a lot of toes. But if we preach on these little minor sins for which we have become comfortable tolerating, we just might have a chance. If we open up our minds and say, you know, I need to improve. I need to work on this. I need to work on that. See, when we preach on all the sins, the spiritual health of the congregations will certainly be improved. There's no doubt about it. Ignoring the sins causes problems, and down the road, they're not going to think that it's a sin, and they're going to get involved in it. So, what about you? Are you comfortable? Are you comfortable in the way you've been living? And really, if we're ever to that point where we're comfortable, we have a problem. And really, now we got to be secure in our salvation. We've got to understand, yes, God is going to be pleased with me, but we know that's conditional. Salvation is conditional upon our obedience. And if we are really working hard to be obedient, then yes, we're secure in our salvation. But if we just get comfortable and don't even think about these things, I mean, it really, everybody needs to improve their efforts to be holy all the time. That includes me, that includes you, that includes all the members of the church, and really, if people want to be saved, that includes the people of this world. So, are you working to become holy as God is holy? Think about those things. That's our lesson for today, and Lord willing, we'll be back again with another lesson. Bye-bye for now.